Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to an all new episode of Beyond 2D. I'm one of your hosts, Jessica Dugas, and this is my fabulous co host.
The boundary counter, Ferran Dozier.
Do we have a nickname now? Is that what we have going on?
Oh, my goodness.
I love it. I
It's
love it.
October.
It is. It is. Happy October.
Yeah.
You have anything exciting going on this month?
I speak at the military base next week. My teammate Jody, his birthday is the 17th, so he's going to go with me to the military base. We're going to hang out and educate some soldiers about sickle cell trait and celebrate his birthday.
Very fun. Very fun. We just finished our last birthday of the household. You know, when you have a gaggle of kids, when that last birthday comes and goes, you're like, thank God, it's done. It's done. But we had a great
the next
time.
cycle.
Yes, but we're not talking about that right now. We have been knee deep in the topic of boundaries the last couple of episodes. This is episode 3 of our 4-part series on boundaries. The first week, we defined what boundaries meant to each of us. Ferran threatened to unfriend me. You can go catch the replay of that.
I'm still here.
He's still here. You believe it? And then last episode, we had the one and only relationship expert Lori Ann Davis on the show. You guys might remember her from past episodes of the Breakthrough Show and Project Joy, and she's probably been on every show on the network, if I'm being honest with you. But she gave some great perspectives about boundaries within relationships, and also touched on it from the singles perspective as well. We had a really good conversation with Lori last week on navigating interpersonal boundaries, and this week we're going to see which direction we go with this. I'm really interested to see how this goes, but we're going to be talking about cultural boundaries, and part of that is embracing diversity. And we have a very special guest for this episode. Ferran, you want to share with everybody about that?
Yes. I met Caldwell Williams in 2018. I went to interview a World War II veteran at this home. And after I got done, Caldwell approached me, shared with me what he was up to. And before I could get home, he had emailed me like his curriculum, like conversations. And I was like, I read it like, wow, like this is a journey that I've been on, since 2011. And so we connected. And just let me give you some of the just key points about his background.
Sure.
So he's other than being 89 years old today, all right? You hear me? 89 years old. He graduated UCLA in 1957. UCLA. Now, that's when college used to be free. Just pay for your books. 1957. The cultural part is why he's here for me, because he's the grandson of slaves. Not like the great. No, he is the grandson. That means his parents were first generation free slaves.
Wow.
All right. In 1970, he created California's first public school charter. Now they have charter schools all day long, but he was able to create a charter school in 1970 from an innovative program school called IPS inside of a school. He had a school inside of a school teaching the conversations but we're going to talk about today around listening and inclusion and diversity. He's taught at some of the top corporations, could I say? Xerox, Hughes, TRW, Pac Bell, with this same conversation. UCLA men's basketball team, Nestle. Like, he also taught this in corporations. And like I said, for me, we've been teaching this to help veterans, right? That transition back into our culture, right? Back into from the mindset of a soldier, back into a civilian. And so from elementary to middle school to corporations to the veterans, this is a human being conversation, right? And I'm grateful for his knowledge and for him trusting me with his curriculum to be a part of it. So let's just bring him up.
And we're gonna have some wisdom tonight. So without further ado,
we got some straight wisdom.
Let's welcome back to the show Caldwell Williams. Caldwell, we're so excited to have you here again tonight.
Pleasure's mine. El gusto es mío.
So, yeah, thanks, Caldwell, for hanging out with us this evening, man. shared just the top of your bio and your history and your background. But what do you want the people to know, that I
Well,
missed?
first, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that a documentary film of my professional life story that I've been working on with a Hollywood producer, director, filmmaker, David Greenwald. We've been working on this for 3 years, is now finished. I haven't seen it yet. It's David's film. And my two sons, their wives, and I are eagerly waiting. Farron, you'll be invited to join us to screen it for the first time. David Greenwald, I think his most popular work was Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a film that many people have heard of. David, in a conversation yesterday, said, Caldwell, this is the best thing I've been associated with in my life. I said, you're raising my expectations, boy. He said, it's Netflix worthy. So I'm eager to see. I can't say more about it than that because it's somebody else's film.
Right.
I've got my own anxiety.
Oh, I'm so excited for you. That's amazing. And I have to tell you from a very personal note, I was thrilled to have you on the last time we had you on as well. And speaking of culture and that we're going to be talking about tonight, I grew up with my grandparents, but I don't think as a child that I really took as many opportunities as there were available to dig in and really find out who they were and about where they came from and their culture. A lot of things I've had to learn after the fact, which is obviously is not coming right from the person. And so I'm so excited to have you here from that generation, because I feel like I feel like generations in themselves can be a culture almost. And so you're connecting me with them through your presence here today. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
One of the ways in which I'm blessed, Farron mentioned that for 8 years, I had a public school in West Los Angeles, of which I was director. And every student in my school had a class with me every day that they were in school. So they had a guidance counselor as a class. And part of what's happening with this documentary film is David has had an opportunity to interview many of these 60-year-olds who were in my school. And they consistently say, I had more access to Caldwell than I had to my own parents. He was always available. And the guidance that I got impacted my life in such a way that it's still the most significant guidance that I had in my lifetime. And so one of the things that reminds me of saying this is the statement you just made about your connection with the people from whom you descended, that wasn't happening in your household. One of the things I think was in a third of the 8 years, turned out to be a great history lesson. Just intuitively, I said to the students, when you go home tonight, ask your parents where you came from and what the circumstances were that motivated their leaving. And in West Los Angeles, we had a diverse population. Some youngsters came back and said, my mother burst into tears. Was not a subject we talked about. We're descended from Armenians, and ours was a slaughter. And so my family never talked about that, but they're now talking about that so that my mother can tell me the pain from whence we come that she was trying to protect me from. And it went on from there. Every student had a different story, the summation of which was, we're all the same. We came from pain, seeking opportunity. And once we arrived, we had different levels of opportunity. We didn't all have the same opportunity. And so I, as the instructor of the class, was the flying buttermilk, the one who was captured and came. But once it arrived, the journey was the same. The struggle to participate in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Right.
Well, Caldwell, again, the topic is cultural boundaries. When you hear that term, cultural boundaries, what comes to mind for you?
My personal family. I'm number 10 of 11 kids. And what comes to mind is my struggle to reconcile what I was learning in the school and university classrooms versus what I was learning from my parents, who were first generation free. I was born to middle-aged parents. My dad was 52 and my mother was 40 when I was born.
Wow.
And so I had these pretty mellow middle-aged folk. Mother was very supportive of dad and deferred to him. And that was my model. Last year, I was having a conversation with my oldest brother's only son, who's now 72 years old. And as we talked about stories that his father related to him, I discovered we had different parents. His father was born to a young couple, struggling to find their own way. And the picture that he has of my parents' relationship was 180 degrees different. She said, Dad was 27 and mother was 17 when they met. And she fell in love with this guy whose mother had died in childbirth when he was 3, who had raised himself and was illiterate. And grandma taught him to read using the Gospels, using the New Testament. And this guy apparently had something akin to a photographic memory because he memorized the Gospels. And apparently that was a requirement for her to be in a relationship with him. So he joined her religion. And in as much as he was one of the few literate persons in his county, he capitalized on that opportunity and preached to pick up a little extra income for his family. Once he embraced my mom's religion and whatever amount of culture she had developed, she stepped back, pushed him forward. She was a deferential, supportive, devoted wife whom I met. And so my older brother had a different picture of parental relationships. And speaking of boundaries, the only model they had was the Gospels and the overseer, slave-owning boss. And they worked out a philosophy based upon that to which they had been exposed. And spare the rod and spoil the child. You gotta. That's straw boss slave owning mentality. But what I also have learned in my adulthood was that white folk were raised with the same model. We have, in my lifetime, gone through the process of trying to end corporal punishment of children in schools. And every one of the states below the Mason-Dixon line, plus Arizona, still beat kids
Yep.
in schools. Yep. The law allows that. And coincidentally, maybe it's not coincidental, but those were also the Trump states who were the slave owning states, who then were the segregated South, solid Democrat states.
Yeah.
That became, because of Lee Atwater's political strategic brilliance, they swarmed in mass to the Republican Party, and they now control that party. That party is now the new nationalist, religious right, racist, and all the other stuff that we battle as a divided nation to deal with these days.
I want to touch on something, Caldwell, you said, and we could move this forward.
Yes.
One of my points was approach other cultures with an open mind, being curious and willing to learn about their customs, traditions, and beliefs. And that's what you're pretty much saying, is that all of our backgrounds came here some type of way, right? And their experience of this United States or wherever they landed, we're all different types. So how do we deal with the cultural boundaries when you have so many different backgrounds in one place? Like I said, we're called the United States, but are we really united with all these different cultural differences and beliefs and traditions?
That's the aspiration. And we haven't succeeded at that. Yeah. One of my good friends, that I can call him that now, I've known him for 25 years, but for 16 years we've become real friends. Peter Haight. Peter Haight's ancestors arrived in New England in 1629. We're the same age range.
Yeah.
Caldwell's grandparents were born slaves. And that was the barrier to our becoming friends. Without any conversation, we simply didn't trust one another, because Peter has never experienced a cultural barrier in his lifetime. He's descended from Englishmen who created this game called the United States. And he moves through the culture like butter through warm syrup. And he, prior to us really getting into real dialogue, wondered, who is this verbose Negro? I haven't met anybody like him, which is also the rhetoric of my UCLA professors when I was halfway through the curriculum. Who is this young Negro? And what I discovered was everyone they had known who looked like, I'm talking about the professors now, everyone they had known who looked like me had been athletes whose coaches said to the professor, take care of my boy, be sure he gets a C so I can keep him eligible to put on the athletic field.
Yeah.
And I had mastered standard English and sought to enter the dialogue in the classroom. And I was an anomaly that they didn't know what to do with.
Okay.
And so Peter and I became friends because we started on that occasion of, a dozen years ago, to pass out Christmas luncheon invitations to the homeless in Santa Monica, our churches in Santa Monica. And one of our parishioners had died, and in her will, she was a wealthy English immigrant. She left in her will an endowment to, in perpetuity, see to it that on Christmas morning, homeless people in Santa Monica had a proper meal, full course luncheon.
Wow.
And so every year, Peter and I walked around Santa Monica handing out formal invitations to luncheon. So we got to know, in that process,
that's how you got to bond those cultures, different backgrounds.
Got to know one another,
Okay.
and and in the process, in our discussion, got to know that we were having a similar experience in that activity, and we did it year after year after year. I even looked forward to it until my bones said, "No, that's enough."
All right, we got some more questions for you, Caldwell.
All right,
Jessica, you want to kind of give the audience an overview of cultural boundaries?
Sure. So there's a definition of what is a cultural boundary that I wanted to talk about briefly. And that is that a cultural boundary indicates a difference in culture, religion, ethnicity, language, or social interaction. These often define geographic areas or regions in which people have common cultural characteristics. And I think, going back to what we were talking about in episode 1, Farhan, of our definition of, and you specifically were saying, like, we need to be able to see it, to see that boundary, and it's difficult when we can't. I think that sometimes these cultural boundaries are definitely in the unseen category. They just exist in the differences that we have. And I wanted to talk briefly about the cultural differences even within our own households. And I was thinking about when I got married, and those cultures coming together or not coming together, and what that looked like. And I wanted to ask both of you about that experience, because in my first marriage, my ex was from the South and I was from up north, as Caldwell so beautifully talked about a little while ago. Those are very different cultures. I grew up very differently than my ex did, and that really played into our relationship quite a bit. And now my husband now is from Canada, and that's a different culture up there than it is here. And so it's been interesting watching kind of those meshing of cultures happen. And I know for us, communication has been a really big deal, of communicating, what things culturally we want to pass on to our children, and what things do we want to mesh together, and what things do we want to keep pure. So I wanted to ask both of you what your experience has been like in meshing cultures, even within families, whether that be friends or love relationships or what have you.
Go, you go first.
Yeah. What immediately comes to mind is when I was drafted in the military service in 1957 after graduating UCLA. I befriended Jim Placek, Placek, a Polish boy, who became friends, and we both had girlfriends and were proceeding toward engagement, et cetera, as we got to know one another. The girl that Jim was engaged to had a French background, and both their families were adamantly opposed to this interracial romance. French and Polish. This was 1957. Yeah. How far we've come. That was those families were defining that as an unacceptable mixture of cultures. But they talked about it in terms of interracial. That was before 1981, when all Europeans became white.
Yeah.
We were hyphenated at that time, Polish Americans and French Americans, but never hyphenated were English Americans, because they created the game. Peter has never been hyphenated and never experienced a barrier. I once had a conversation with him when the ex-senator John Tunney died. He was in our age range, and I had known him because one of my former students worked for him when he was a senator from California. And so Peter and I were chatting about that, and Peter said, yeah, they moved into our neighborhood in Connecticut, and he and I went to the same school, but he was not a serious student. And we went from our private school to Yale to law school, to Wall Street, etc. And I said to her, how did that happen, Peter? Gene Tunney, the father, was a world boxing champion and Irish Catholic. And so I said, was it because Gene earned money and broke out of the Irish ghetto? Is that how he moved into your neighborhood? He said, no. John, Gene's son, got a girl in our neighborhood pregnant.
Oh, that's one way to do it.
That's how he got in.
And the Tunneys moved up and past that boundary using his genitals. And that's also an American story.
Yeah. So for me, my last marriage, she was Filipino, and I didn't have any issues. I believe, like Caldwell said, well, even before I joined the military, there was a magnet program in our area, so I was bused to the Valley in 7th grade. So I had a mixture of different backgrounds in school, and then I went to Bancroft in LA. So it was like I was able to just connect with people. It wasn't about color. So, being in that family with the Filipino family, I had no problem. Like, the food is good. I mean, and they were somewhat more Americanized anyway. So I've never really had that, issue of a cultural boundary with people. And I believe that at the end of the day, it comes back to you as the person first, right? And so because of my exposure to that, I didn't have any barriers that I felt was like, oh, you can't play with the white kids, you can't go over here, you can't go to this neighborhood, you can't do this, because I went to school with everybody. So it was like, if I was in, the white area, rich area of where I lived in Melrose, it was normal for us as children. Now, maybe the adults might have saw it differently, but for me as a person, and then when I went to the military, I was exposed to a whole lot more of different backgrounds. So yeah, I that's why for me the cultural boundaries and having it as something that I could see in physical nature versus how I think about them, they're too different for me.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Caldwell.
1965, when I transferred and became a guidance counselor at University High School in West Los Angeles, it was prior to the explosion of private schools. Wealthy, affluent, educated West Siders still sent their kids to public schools. And so, the son of Cy Ramo, the TRW American father of the anti-ballistic missile, son was a counselor of mine, et cetera. The Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry's daughter was a counselor of mine, et cetera. But I discovered, are you familiar with Los Angeles?
A little bit. I mean, I've been there, but I couldn't tell you where anything is.
I discovered that if you lived north of Sunset in Bel Air, you were at the top of the pyramid on the campus. If you lived between Sunset and Wilshire, you were a step down, but you were still ahead of the people who lived between Wilshire and Santa Monica, who were ahead of the people who lived between Santa Monica and the freeway. Our campus was balkanized, never acknowledged, because in America, the historians write the romantic version of the story and they don't talk about this. And those kids from those communities had their own separate place on campus where they congregated at nutrition and lunch and did not cross boundaries to a class above their status.
Okay. All right.
And never discussed on campus. And when I sought to bring that into the dialogue, oh, this is a troublemaker. Why do you speak so disparagingly of these wonderful kids? And
that's
go ahead.
That's actually one of the things on that list that I was talking about before the show of geographic boundaries. One of the things on that list is economic boundaries, and it says an economic boundary is one that sets the borders between economic regions. And sometimes we hear that phrase on the other side of the tracks. This saying comes from the idea that towns are separated into rich and poor parts of the town based on which side of the railway tracks you live on. And an example of this, they talk about the divide, the two sides of Berlin during the Cold War can be seen as an economic boundary because the West was wealthy while the East crumbled under communism. And to this day, Berlin remains economically poorer than the other side, which is really interesting as well.
Yeah.
The boy who made the documentary film of my life story lived between Wilshire and Santa Monica, kind of in the middle of that syndrome. And the story that he tells is I was a 16-year-old suicidal drug addict when this man lifted me out of my circumstances. And literally what I did, I had been impressed with him as an intelligent youngster, hanging out with cohorts whom I didn't think would live past 20. They were all on that path. And in 1968, I had gotten permission from parents and gained access to a beach house up at Pismo Beach. And I took a dozen boys on a weekend retreat as a part of my group of counseling approach to guidance. And I invited this young man, David, to join us. And he went through some agonizing considerations, but he joined us. And in the retreat were boys from north of Sunset and north of Wilshire. And he connected with one of them, and they became lifelong best friends and godparent to each other's children. And so that event enabled him to break through that barrier. And 53 years later, he calls me on the phone and says, it's time to tell your story. The world needs to know about you and your work.
Yeah.
You saved my life.
Yeah. And that's, I guess, do you want to take a break or you want to just keep?
Yeah, let's take a quick break. And I wanted to break today with actually my recorded version of Dorothy Ogier's For Love poem, because Dorothy passed away last October. So we're coming up on a year since her passing. She was a very good friend of the Breakthrough Show Network. And her For Love poem was a poem that she wrote in the terror attacks that happened in Brussels, and her friend was killed. And she couldn't find anything to do in that moment other than write poetry, which is what she loved. And so she wrote this poem, and this is a recording of Dorothy reading that poem, and we'll be right back after this.
Let's go.
I shall stand for love, even with a broken soul, even with a heavy heart. I shall stand for love, for the world is wounded, not just my little piece of land, where I am mostly safe, where I am mostly well, but our world, everywhere, every day. I shall stand for love, because we need more light, not more death, not more power, not more bombs. I shall stand for love, so that our children are safe, so that our friends are sheltered, so that our borders are open. I shall stand for love, even with a broken soul, even with a heavy heart.
Welcome back to Beyond 2D. That was Dorothy O.J. I invite you to hear all of the over 70 languages that poem was recorded in by visiting weshallstandforlove.world. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about tonight is about as we are sharing parts of our culture with other people, my opinion is that it's important for us to share about our culture and where we come from so that we can, in an effort to understand each other better and find that common ground, because that's really what I'm hearing a lot from you tonight, Caldwell, is the importance of finding that common ground so that we can come together despite, or maybe even not despite, but in honor of the differences that we do have. And so I'm curious if you feel like there are boundaries when it comes to sharing about our culture and cultural practices. And one of the phrases that I kept hearing as I was researching about this topic was cultural appropriation, which is a whole fun topic. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
What comes to mind for me is language. We say it's English, but it's not the same above the Mason-Dixon line as you found in your first marriage as it is below the Mason-Dixon line. And I found during my corporate work, where you have the disparate people in the workforce, the greatest usurper of the leader's time is putting out internal family fires. Dog eat dog, people climbing over one another, and to the detriment of the pursuit of the bottom line. And I discovered that I had something to contribute with what I developed in my curriculum. I call it empowering dialogue skills that empower rather than compete or struggle. And we discovered that the same words don't mean the same thing to every subculture in the nation. And I haven't found much discussed or written about this and published. And so what I did, instead of focusing upon the differences, was I present a model that I call empowering dialogue skills: listening without defending, speaking without offending, and introduce this into the corporate culture where everybody goes through the experience and we come out closer to the same meaning, and the harmony needle goes way up. And I subsequently found that the problems we had identified there is a problem that pervades the whole society. And Ferran and I recently met a young man that we pursued, perhaps working together, and who had shared that when he had gone south to visit his relatives whom he hadn't known because he had grown up in the West, he could hardly, they hardly understood one another. He thought they both spoke the same language. This was from the same family, same immediate family.
Yeah.
And that only put me in touch with a comparable experience that still exists or persists in my family. When we get the extended family together in the meeting place, the home of whatever, you get different clusters of people who speak the same language. It was one.
I wanted to add to that, Caldwell. You know, it said language, and that's for me. That's what I've learned in my last 13-year journey is language and how we describe life versus how we say what's happening. You know, but I think it. Not that I think, but a part of this whole cultural boundaries portion of it, and Jessica, you mentioned it earlier. As an individual person, you have to be willing to even want to look in someone else's culture, right? We're so separated in our conversations and life with the labels that we label one another, that we were taught these labels, that we are sometimes not even willing to even look to see what another culture is about. And I'm only concerned about my culture only, and I'm only concerned about what's going on with Black. But it's like when you step outside of that conversation, you'll see that most human beings are dealing with the same stuff around their culture. And it's not the skin color of the culture. It's the human being of that culture. And that to me goes back to, are you even willing to look at your own culture and tell the truth? And then are you willing to look at the people around you culture to get a better understanding, to get a relatedness even to the different cultures? Right. And I believe if we did that part of that, like Carl was saying, his curriculum, when you're giving up a person an opportunity to do that and they're willing to look at that, they're going to find out that I'm no different than you. My experiences are different from where I come from, but how I experience those could be similar to yours.
One of the things that I found, and I didn't know it, so obviously I didn't plan it, but the girl that I married, and our marriage lasted 61 years. I might have told this story before, but I was scheduled to graduate in June of 1956. And during finals week, I saw this girl who caused the buttons on my shirt to pop off.
It's a clean version.
Beautiful, beautiful in every way. Tall, slim, intelligent, just most beautiful girl on the campus, without a doubt. And I knew instinctively I needed a proper introduction. This was not somebody you hit on. And I couldn't find anybody that knew her that could make the introduction. So I chose not to graduate. I came back an extra semester and I graduated in January of 57 because this girl. And it worked for 61 years.
Stop.
She was
really?
She was beautiful. And in our 61 years, I can tell you that it was she who opened doors for us because people wanted to be around this gorgeous woman. And that's another
cultural boundary we'll talk about.
Yeah.
Yes. Ostensibly both Black, but one pretty and one looked like me. And people wanted to be around her. And once we got in the door, I could make my case, and for the most part did it successfully. Okay. And what I had learned from that, when I left public education in 1980 to hang out my shingle to attack the corporate world who had denied even giving me an interview in 57, I hired Madeline Cummings, who's a 50-year-old pretty woman who had been a singer, but she was gorgeous. She was my secretary, and we repeated the same cycle. I got in corporate doors initially because people welcomed Madeline Cummings, the beautiful secretary.
That you break a cultural barrier right there.
Yes. And we don't talk about that very much, but the way you look has a lot to do with whether people support you. Yeah. And Donald Trump has benefited from that, as did Bill Clinton. And if you compare Papa Bush with the Massachusetts governor, what didn't get discussed was how they looked.
Yeah.
And John F. Kennedy. Come on.
You got some more subjects for us, Jessica?
I wanted to chime in just for a moment on this from in my experience. And one of the things that I shared that I grew up in New England, but I lived for a time in the backwoods of Mississippi. And let me tell you about culture shock, because I did not realize I was never exposed at the deep South levels of racism and being separate, and I just never I never understood that. I never was exposed to it. I believed what I was told in school. This is a melting pot and we're all happy and it's great and wonderful, right? And my classes here in New England were truly that, a melting pot of different types of people, colors, cultures, different things like that. So I never saw people being separate. And when I couldn't understand what I was witnessing firsthand in Mississippi, there was a documentary that came out that Morgan Freeman had done about, there's a town in Mississippi that still today, has separate black and white proms, and they choose, all sides of this equation choose to do that. And so I wanted to add that it's a very interesting documentary if you get a chance to watch it, and it really speaks.
I've seen it. Yes,
you've seen. I did. Yeah. I hope you enjoyed it as much. I enjoyed it from a learning perspective as much as I did. But it speaks to what Varun was talking about how we have to want to. We have to want to choose to make that choice, to find that common ground, to meet in the middle, to find those things that bring us together. And it really helped me to understand that not only where we're coming from, but in a lot of cases, it was simply a matter of the things that I was experiencing were a matter of choice. It's how they grew up. It's how it was passed down to them. And they are continuing with that choice to further those beliefs or those thoughts that they have about people that are different than them.
I suspect very much motivated by fear of change. Farron and I are in dialogue now with a young man in part of Southern California. And in a recent conversation, a gentleman from the pharmaceuticals industry is complaining about the inability of his industry to recruit Black employees who don't want to work for Big Pharma, and because they don't want to have to get the degrees that you have to, college degrees. And he said, you don't need a college degree to work in the pharmaceutical industry. There are these jobs, and we can't get these people. We can't recruit these people. But the people who are saying no are expressing it from a position of bravado, and that covers up fear of failure, fear of not being accepted, fear. But it's not cool to say you're scared. If you're from,
and those could be those emotional boundaries. That's where it goes back to the impact of the coach. But Carl, before we got about 9 minutes, this is what I want you to leave us with. By embracing diversity through culture boundaries in this way, we can enrich our own lives, build meaningful connections, and contribute to a more inclusive and harmonious world. Can you talk about the communication that it takes to have a harmonious culture with these boundaries disappearing, with your listening skills?
I've observed, and I haven't seen this published that how can I put it?
Let me guide you. Let me guide you. So
yes.
I want to go somewhere with this. We started off our show here around communication, and really that's what it's going to boil down to, communication. So how does your listening skills in teaching communication in that harmonious way? I want you to talk about that part.
Okay. Exclusion inflicts mindful injury upon the excluded. Fractured integrity, offensive speech, self-doubt, self-loathing, fits of rage, depression, all of which are symptoms of undiagnosed and untreated injury that can be traced back to the experience of exclusion. In the last 2 years, since I no longer drive, I've been using public transportation in Los Angeles. And the part of town in which the bus is passing gives me a different cultural experience on the bus. In some communities, people are loudly talking into their cell phones, using profanity and offensive language for everybody on the bus to hear. In another part of town, the bus ride is quiet. Anyone who's talking on their phone speaks softly so that they can't be heard. An illustration of undiagnosed, untreated mindful injuries that leaves one still speaking offensively, that you'll find culturally is compatible and consistent with the subculture in which that group is operating. I didn't say that very well, but the learning to speak without offending the other, because when you offend the other, you're going to trigger their defenses and nothing is going to productively follow that. And learning to listen without defending. Excluded people listen defensively. As a matter of fact, they're forming their rebuttal while you're talking to them. And very often in the corporate setting, teaching that to the leader makes all the difference. You know, I've told this person this 1,000 times. Yeah, and you told him 1,001 and he didn't listen. He didn't hear you then as well. And what I also found was very often the leader was operating the same way. The employee has spoken to you 1,000 times and you didn't listen because you had your position and you're right because you're the owner. And so in our curricular approach, we introduce the notion of listening without defending and speaking without offending, and watch the rewards come.
And it's something that he has taught since what year? 1960? When did you start?
Well, it started in 1959 with a group of ninth grade, mostly boys who had failed arithmetic since third grade. And when a book fight ensued in my classroom, I put the books in the closet and wrote my own curriculum. And they said, "Don't you know who we are? You're using all these big words. We're the dummies." I said, "Oh, you don't know who you are. You've been conned." You can learn, you can grow, and the evidence is right here in the room. You've already learned and grown. You're listening to me. I'm speaking a language, and you were born without speaking a language. You were 19 to 21 inches when you were born. Look at you now. You've grown. So don't tell me you can't. The evidence is right here in the seat. and I will not accept you otherwise. And they bought in. And by the Christmas faculty party, the principal pulled me aside and said, I'm impressed with your relationship with kids. As a 25-year-old, I didn't know what he was saying. What he was saying was, I gave you all the dummies and these kids are behaving themselves. What are you doing?
Yeah.
I want you in the counseling office so you can do whatever you're doing with more kids. And to be acknowledged, I would have jumped over the moon if he had said, because I was finally acknowledged for something that I was doing. And I found my voice in a graduate counseling credentialing program, and discovered group counseling because I had a degree in business, and I had more kids who wanted to see me than I had time to see them, and they all had the same lament. So I put them together in groups in 1960. In 1960, group therapy, group counseling did not exist in conventional institutions in this country.
Yeah.
I know because my committee, my master's committee, said, you can't do that. Why not? My principal has said yes. They said, well, protocol is we give you a reading list of the experts in the field. That's where you start. And there are no experts in that field, so you can't start. And my principal supported me, and I said, to hell with you, we're doing it anyway. And by the mid-60s, within 5 years, group therapy had exploded across the world.
Yeah.
And one in Los Angeles, there's an organization called the Los Angeles Psychoanalytic Institute, founded by two psychiatrists. Both of whom hurt because I'd made the news doing what I was doing. And one called me and said, invited me to enroll in his class where he would teach me how to facilitate groups. Unknown, apparently they didn't have a conversation with one another because the other one called me and said, I'll pay you if you'll do a workshop teaching my psychiatry students your group process.
You know, Caldwell, we got like a couple of seconds left, man. Can you give me in your mind one word that when you hear cultural boundaries that you want people to walk away when you hear that, when they hear that cultural boundaries from you? What would be one key word that you want people to take away?
Oh my gosh, you're difficult.
I got one. Yeah. I got one in my mind, but what do you want people to? Can I give you a hint?
Yes, please.
So for me, as we wrap up the show, the one thing that I wanted people to take away from these cultural boundaries is to be able to listen to one another. To listen, because if you have that opportunity to listen to one another, right?
I heard that, and I was loath to say it.
Why? That's the whole conversation.
Yes.
So that's what I would say. Because if you listen to one another really truly in a harmonious way,
yes,
the boundaries in your mind crumble. They disappear because you're now connecting to another person in a way that is engaging and not defensive, right?
And we define listening as recreating the lyrics and the tune. Allow yourself to feel what it feels like to feel that way, and truly get it. And with confidence, know that you're not going to be damaged, and the other person isn't going to win.
Right.
That's not where we're coming from. What is going to happen is you're both going to be transformed in the same direction.
Yeah. Jessica, I'm gonna give it back to you. That was a lot of key points in those conversations that he mentioned around cultural boundaries.
Yeah.
I mean, I hope people get a chance to listen, for themselves to hear the different ways that it looks like from his experience, right?
Absolutely.
And that's what we want. For me doing this show, we want you to walk away with your experience of these conversations with a new perspective. But you got to be willing. We can give you all the communication, how to be accountable. how to understand, how to listen. We could give you all that. But if you're not willing to even make an attempt for yourself to see what that looks like, as he said, you're not going to lose in the conversation. You're not going to, they're not going to win the conversation. It's about what we really want in relationships is to connect with one another.
Mm.
And I believe that exists in language. And if you relate to one another in language, the physical boundaries will be present and the emotional boundaries will disappear.
Mm.
That's what I want to say. Go ahead.
Love
Jessica.
that. I love that. I had the privilege, I shared Dorothy Auger's poem earlier, and I had the privilege before she passed away to sit in on the recordings of all of these different versions of her poem. And I speak English and barely at that most days. So I didn't know any of the other languages going into these recordings. And so my word that I sum up all of this with for me is a word that I know Farhan loves so much as well. And that's love, because at the end of the day, a lot of times language is a boundary that we can't cross because we don't understand. And if we can choose, that's another word that I love. If we can choose to love regardless of these beliefs and boundaries and all of that, then I believe that there's so much that's possible with being able to find that common ground and get along and have that peace that we're looking for. Next episode, the final episode on our boundary series, it's the last one. We're going to be talking about pushing limits, overcoming self-imposed boundaries. And I think this is really going to sum it up beautifully, because all of these conversations that we've had up until this point comes down to those things. These are either our choice to implement boundaries, and if boundaries are implemented for us, it is our choice to follow those, remove ourselves, whatever that looks like. So it all comes down to choice and it being self-imposed. So in the final episode, we explore the real or self-imposed limitations. Can creating boundaries ever go wrong? What happens when we hold ourselves back? How can we break free from these constraints to achieve personal growth, as Caldwell so beautifully talked about, and success, and expand our own boundaries that we've created? So really excited to talk about that next episode, and hope you'll be here for that.
I want to say to you, Jessica, publicly, that one episode that we had when I walked away from that show, understanding, not even just relating, but understanding that boundary for you, how it gave you that strength. Like I get chills now because I have an understanding. Not that it's understanding and relatedness are very powerful, but they're different. But I'm emotional because I could understand how that is for you and how that boundary could still produce a level of love, right? But the love has to come from yourself first.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So I could see why, even though I don't use the term boundary, but I really got present to like the strength of that boundary for you, that it created that space for that love for you. So this show has touched me. I'm really touched because the way that I protected myself was still a boundary. But how important love is to me. Like you did that. And I heard you because I was able to listen to you through all of my, no, I'm right. Right? But I really appreciate you because you gave me another perspective of boundaries from a strength and not from a defense mechanism. So
I appreciate you sharing this space with me as well. And from my perspective of that same conversation, I took out of it that we all receive words and hear words and process words in very different ways. And it's if I believe that a boundary is love, then it's up to me to show that. and not worry about the word, that it's up to me to just be it and show it and share my story. And that's, at the end of the day, as we've all talked about, it comes back to ourselves, right? And so I thank you for sharing that with me, and thank you for sharing this space with me, and thank you, Caldwell, for sharing this space with us today. We really appreciate you.
I love being included. Thank you.
All right, guys. So we'll be back in 2 weeks for the final episode of Boundaries.
It'll be over.
Make sure you guys connect with Caldwell at the links in the show notes as well. And you can also go back and catch the last time that Caldwell was on our show, and we talked about communication with Michelle Risa. That was another incredible episode. I'm one of your hosts, Jessica Jugas. This is Ferran Dozier. That's been Caldwell Williams. And we will see you guys next time on another episode of Beyond 2D. Good night, everybody.
Peace.
Good night.